Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to this fifth in the series, The African Drama, The Building of Nations. Our speaker this evening has both bachelor's and master's degree in theology, a PhD in Oriental Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. He spent some 6 years in West Africa in linguistic research, and after having been a member of the faculty of Cornell and also the Hartford Seminary Foundation, he joined UCLA as professor of African language in 1960. Until about 10 years ago, Professor Welmers was the only American scholar who concentrated on the description and the teaching of African languages. He has done major analytical work on some 10 African languages and has had some experience with many more. He has in fact taught some 10 or more African languages. He has been quite active in language instruction for the Peace Corps. As a matter of fact, he's just advised me that he walked into this room this evening from such a session with Peace Corps trainees. In his own modest self-appraisal, he states that because his work has been so varied, he's really at home with only one African language, the Liberian Pella language. For others, he says he's limited to simple conversations, but rumor has it that he can obtain at least coffee in any language he has heard of. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor William E. Welmers, who will speak on the problems of communication in a multilingual context. Professor Welmers.
Thank you. Can you see this map from over there? Try to move it a little more favorably. How's that? Okay. Africa is indeed a very large place. Many of the countries of Africa are very large places, and the linguistic problem of Africa in this age is unquestionably one of multilingualism. There are about 1,000 languages in Africa, and when I say that, I mean that there are 1,000 forms of speech which are not mutually intelligible with each other. Sometimes the forms of speech that are heard in Africa are referred to as dialects rather than languages, with the popular usage of that word as referring to a form of speech used by a small number of people, not written, and with no grammar, dictionary, or educational system. In a more technical sense, however, a dialect is one of two or more forms of a language. And we say that two people speak the same language if they can readily understand each other, and they speak two different languages if they cannot understand each other at all. There are, of course, borderline cases in which people can make themselves understood to each other with considerable difficulty, and we can't always say under such circumstances whether people are speaking different dialects of one language or different languages. The terminology and the definitions of the terminology are not that precise. However, it would apparently be possible to assemble an audience of about 1,000 Africans, carefully select such an audience, such that no two of them would be able to communicate with each other at all. So gross is the problem of multilingualism in Africa. In addition to that, there is hardly any administrative political unit in Africa in which a single language is the majority language, or in which a single African language is the official language. There are a few, only minor exceptions. Somalia has as its major language, spoken by most Somalis, the Somali language. At the same time, even Somali has not been made the official language in the sense that French is the language of France, simply because certain kinds of terminology, certain kinds of subject matter had never been expressed in Somali, and it was found difficult, if not impossible, to translate the Somalia Constitution into the language. In a few other places, there is a language which is probably a majority language. In the new kingdom of, or the new political unit of Burundi, a language which has probably two dialectal forms corresponding to the old divisions of Rwanda and Urundi, is the language of most of the people. In southern Rhodesia, or Rhodesia if you will, Shona is a language of a large number of the people with a certain variety of dialects. I'm not quite sure whether it's the majority or not. But on the other extreme, if you take instances like that of Sierra Leone, you will find countries in which no indigenous language is nearly a majority language. In Sierra Leone, perhaps 1/4 of the people speak Mende. Another 1/4 of the people speak Temne. And the remaining 50% of the people speak a variety of smaller languages. Similarly, in Liberia, there are a couple of fairly sizable languages, principally Kwela and Bassa, but in addition to those, there are a dozen or more smaller languages spoken by smaller numbers of people, making up all the rest of the population put together. Nigeria represents a rather unusual case in that Nigeria is subdivided politically into 4 divisions. The northern region has as its major language Hausa, and it is perhaps true that Hausa is understood, if not spoken, by a majority of the people in the northern region. In the western region, Yoruba is undoubtedly a majority language. In the eastern region, Igbo is the largest language, but is probably not the language of the majority. Efik is another sizable language, and there are countless small languages in eastern Nigeria. In the new Midwestern region, there is no one predominant language. There is a language of prestige because it's spoken in the capital, Benin City. The language is Bini, or sometimes called Edo. There are other languages which are perhaps spoken by more people than that one, but no language is certainly the predominant one in the Midwest. And so it is generally throughout all of Africa. There is a linguistic diversity, a confusion of tongues, if you will, that makes mass communication or communication over wide areas quite a different proposition from what it is in most of the countries with which we are familiar. There are, to be sure, in this country a number of foreign-born people to whom English is not a native or first language. At the same time, they are living in an English-speaking environment and context, and as immigrants, their children or their children's children will adopt English as their language. The languages of Europe and of Asia, for that matter, and Latin America that have been imported to this country tend to die out unless immigration continues very heavily. But when languages are on their home soil, they don't die out so easily. In fact, the best way to get rid of a language is to kill off the people who speak it. And I don't think anyone would like to recommend that. There are nevertheless some people who feel that in many a country of Africa, or in Africa as a whole, one language, or at least at most a very few languages, ought to be predominant. Well, one cannot legislate languages out of existence. People will continue speaking their own small languages in their homes, in their tribal communities, conducting their daily affairs, and particularly in talking about the more intimate parts of their life, their philosophy, their religion, their hatreds and their loves. These are things that will continue to go on in people's own native languages. Even at that, if we may compare the United States once more, there are said to be more monolingual speakers of Navajo today than there were 65 years ago at the turn of the century. More people who speak Navajo as their only language. On its home soil, a language tends to grow or decrease in size with its population. It is true that in the course of history, many languages, some of them important languages, have disappeared. Ancient Egyptian has disappeared, so has Sumerian, so have others. But this has taken place over centuries and even millennia, and it has taken place only by invasions of a vastly superior people, superior not simply in terms of culture, but primarily in terms of numbers. And it is only under such circumstances that languages readily disappear. Over 100 years ago, a scholar of German origin, but working with a British mission by the name of Kella, collected samples in Freetown, Sierra Leone of some 165 languages. Now, 110 years later, with the exception of 3 of those 165 languages, which were undoubtedly small at the time, every one of the remaining languages is still spoken, is still thriving, and it is spoken in the same place where it was spoken in Kella's day over a century ago. These languages don't die out, and Africa is faced with a continuing multilingualism. Let us define the problem still a little farther. We live in a day of mass oral communication, not simply the press, but also radio and television. Radio is spreading rapidly in Africa, even into interior places. We once lived in a village in Liberia where the first time the people of the community heard a radio, they didn't believe that we were talking to someone 20 miles away. They thought that there was somebody in the box who was making the noise. And yet, only 15 years or so later, one of those very people carries around his own transistor radio and listens to the Voice of America and to Radio Liberia and to a mission radio station. Radio is making rapid strides. Television is coming in and will undoubtedly make rapid strides as well, perhaps not as rapidly as radio because of higher costs. But Nigeria, Liberia, and other countries have instituted television stations and television programs. Now, the American is tempted to ask, will not this bring about a breakdown in this problem of communication? Will it not cut across language boundaries? And the answer is, in major part, no. Because if you do not understand the language of the broadcast, you're not going to listen very carefully. If you cannot understand what's being said, you'll turn off your set and wait until something comes on that you can understand. And so in Ghana, where the news is broadcast daily in 3 or 4 languages, other than English, 3 or 4 indigenous languages, and in Nigeria, where something of the same sort takes place, there are many, many people who do not at present understand these languages, to whom the advantages of mass oral communication by way of radio is denied. This is inevitable for the time being, but it certainly is not a situation that is going to cause people to learn new languages. Furthermore, learning new languages by means of radio or television is not a particularly ideal way to go about it. In our Peace Corps language classes, we have it demonstrated a score of times every hour, I suppose, that the way a person learns a language is to have the speaker of the language look surprised or puzzled or annoyed or displeased or amused at the student's response. If the student says a word wrong, the native speaker of the language may say, "No, that wasn't right, say it this way." Or he may laugh and say, "You said something entirely different from what I said." Or he may just repeat the word and correct the pronunciation in one or another detail. But this is the way one learns a new language, or even a new dialect of a language. And the radio and the television set can't say no. They can't correct you. And until the time comes that that can be brought about, when there can be intercommunication between the radio and the speaker, which I don't think is in the near future, until that time, radio and television are not going to be very substantial means for teaching new languages to people. So, as I say, Africa is still faced with the problem of multilingualism. And the question is, how is this problem going to be tackled on the political scene, on the economic scene, in terms of international relations as well, in all the respects in which Africa contributes, in which Africans contribute to their national and to their international life, what can be done about this problem of people being unable to communicate with each other. Now, at the risk of sounding pessimistic, I want to start off by saying not much. That is, not much in the terms that we think of it. There is not going to be any one mass movement, any great campaign. There's not going to be any legislation or any other single force that will suddenly or even quickly bring about a drastic change in this situation. Any change that takes place is going to be a gradual change. And meanwhile, the problem is one of adapting to the circumstances rather than attempting to change the circumstances. One cannot legislate about language effectively. One cannot force a change of language without committing other crimes. So that one simply has to face the diversity of languages and do the best that can be done with it. Now, what can be done, for that matter, what has been done, what has developed in the nature of the course in Africa? One answer to that question, one development that has taken place, is the fact that a very, very large number of Africans are pretty well the masters of more than one language. In Nigeria, a speaker of a fairly small language in the north will ordinarily speak Hausa as a second language. One of the young men we use here in our Hausa instructional program is not a native speaker of Hausa, although he has spoken Hausa as a second language since earliest childhood. His home language was something else. In much of northern Nigeria, Hausa is used as a second language by speakers of other languages. In addition to that, many speakers of the major languages and even many of the minor languages speak a European language as a second language. In the former British territories and in Liberia, English is fairly widespread, though by no means universal. In the former French and Belgian territories, French is again fairly widespread, though I warn you, by no means universal. Similarly, in the Portuguese territories, almost anywhere you go, a fair number of people will be found who speak Portuguese. This does not mean that these languages are by any means universal means of communication. If you want to talk only to government officials in Nigeria, or people who operate stores in the major cities, or school teachers, you can indeed get along with a form of English. But if you want to go into a village and talk to the common people, the people who do have the franchise, after all, the parents who are concerned about sending their children to school, they cannot be addressed in English, in the case of Nigeria. Some other language has to be used. The advantages of so many Africans speaking more than one language, usually more than one African language and possibly English or French in addition, are obvious. But the limitations are equally obvious. One still cannot have mass communication. In the future, I strongly suspect, and in many respects I am basing my planning on this for the foreseeable future of my lifetime, I strongly suspect that this process will continue, that Africans will increasingly become the masters of 2, 3, and even 4, in some instances more, languages. A speaker of a small language may speak that at home. He may speak a neighboring larger language for communication with members of that tribe, perhaps for use in the market. He may speak one of the really big or major languages of his general area or his country as a third language, and then possibly a European language as a fourth. Now, this seems rather appalling to us Americans who are so proudly and snobbishly used to being monolingual. When we travel in Europe, we do everything we can to get along with English, and we rather tend to look down on people who don't speak English. It may seem rather surprising to us that a person can develop mastery of 3 or 4 languages and still do some other things in his life. But actually, when this begins at an early age, there's no reason why a person cannot learn 3 or 4 languages. With every new language he learns, he's acquiring more knowledge about other things, about other cultures. I suspect that a quadrilingual African would make a pretty good student of cultural anthropology. It is not as frightening as it may seem to think of people speaking and understanding 3 or 4 languages. It happens to many people in Africa already. I think it will happen in the future. Another principle, however, I think in the development of communication in Africa in the future is that the small languages will continue, and if we, and may I dare say, if the leaders of the African world too are wise, these small languages will not be disparaged and will not be discouraged. They cannot be wiped out, and to discourage and disparage them is only to bring offense to the people who speak them. At present, Radio Ghana broadcasts in 3 or 4 African languages. And there is talk, I'm sure, among Ghanaians. There's certainly talk among Americans who perhaps don't know what they're talking about anyway, to the effect that Ghana would be so much better off if there were only one language, if English were the universal, the national language. But now, how does that make a speaker of, let's say, Nzima feel? Nzima is a fairly small language in the southwestern corner of Ghana. It was Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah's native language as a child, although he got away from it when he was about 11 or 12 years old. But how does it make a speaker of Nzima feel to be told that his language is no good, that if he doesn't learn English, he's no good, and that for the benefit of the important people in the country, we will broadcast in Fanti and Tri and Ga and Ewe, but we're not going to broadcast in Nzima because that is insignificant. It would seem to me that Ghana will be much more of a unity and that the Nzima people will be much more Ghanaians if the government will recognize that their language has an equal dignity with the much larger languages in other parts of the country. I would not measure the dignity of a language by the number of speakers it has. I would measure the dignity of the language by the dignity of an individual who speaks it. I believe there are Africans here this evening who speak some very large African languages. I dare say there are some also who are speakers of rather small languages. And as far as I'm concerned, your language is just as important to me as Yoruba or Hausa or Swahili, because you are a person just as much as a speaker of Yoruba or Hausa or Swahili is a person. You have the same dignity and you have the same right to hear and to be heard. Ideally, therefore, communication in this multilingual context of Africa should not be denied in any language. Now, to practice the ideal, of course, is quite a different thing than to state it. But I think it is very much worthwhile to state it in any case, to state that we are not interested in obliterating or disparaging any language, no matter how small. Whatever function it now has in the community where it is spoken is a legitimate and a dignified function. And if it is possible, it would be a wonderful idea if we could use that language, perhaps your language, for other functions as well. May I illustrate that? In the eastern part of northern Nigeria, just on the Cameroon boundary, I was working for a while in the Jukun language for a matter of a few months. I was working with a Protestant mission that was attempting to reach the Jukun people through the medium of the Hausa language. Unfortunately, they didn't realize how little the Jukun people actually did understand Hausa, and their message was not getting across nearly as effectively as they supposed, because their words weren't fully understood. And I urged them, if they wanted to be more effective in their work, to take up the study of Jukun and to use it in their work. And one young lady among their mission staff took that very seriously, worked very hard, and did an excellent job in learning the language and in using it in her work. She finally conducted a women's meeting for about an hour one afternoon in which she spoke Jukun and nothing else. Now, that audience included some women who were from a neighboring, even smaller tribe named Kutep, perhaps 10,000 people at the most. I've heard estimates as low as 2,000. And some of these women came to her afterwards and said, "Now you have shown us that you can learn a language like Jukun. You can put it into writing and write things in it, for this missionary had done so. You have shown that that can be done. Now you must do it for Kutep." That wasn't in the plans. Actually, most of the Kutep people could already understand Jukun very well, and we thought it would be possible to work with them through the Jukun language. But their own tribal pride, their own linguistic pride, an understandable and a lovable trait, so asserted itself when they found out what could be done that they insisted on work in their own language. Now, I'm sure this coincided with a rise of tribalism among that group anyway, but the fact of the matter is that there are more Kutep people today than there were 15 years ago when this process started. There are more Kutep people today than 15 years ago who cannot understand Jukun, because now they are refusing to learn to understand Jukun. They are sticking with their own language because they know it also can be developed. In that same area, there's an even smaller language, the Ndoro language, spoken by, according to the 1938 census, 1,169 people. And the missionary said to me, "Surely you don't think that we ought to do any work in Ndoro," in spite of the fact that most of these 1,169 people spoke and understood nothing but Ndoro. And I said, "Surely I mean that you should do work in Ndoro. Suppose one of you were a minister in a congregation back in the United States. Don't you think you'd be expending your life in a most profitable way if 1,169 people knew you personally and from time to time heard your message or at least knew what it was about? Believe me, if you go into these 2 Ndoro villages and spend your life there, every last one of them will know who you are and what you're there for. And that's a worthwhile way then to expend your life. You'd better get out there and learn the language." Well, in these respects, it may be that in little ways we can approximate the ideal of communicating to people in their own languages. Certainly at the level of national policy, for many practical reasons, it's not going to be feasible. One would hardly dare ask one of our great publishing concerns to publish textbooks for the school system of in a language all of whose speakers together number only about 1,000, and the school population of which must be much smaller. There are certainly practical obstacles to these things. But whatever our practical solutions may be, or the practical solutions of African administrations, I hope that we will never lose sight of this ideal that communicating with a man in his own language is the thing that stirs him to the heart. It's been said by another, I won't take credit for the apt way of putting it, that we Americans have spanned the oceans with jet liners. We built bridges across rivers and swamps. We've built roads across deserts. And in impenetrable jungles, we have even built landing strips and heliports. We've gone everywhere in the world only to fail in the last 18 inches, the 18 inches that separates my nose from the nose of the person I want to talk to. Someone else has put it this way: the world speaks 3,000 languages. Africa speaks 1,000. Why should we Americans speak only one? I don't particularly like the advertisement, but it has a bit of a message that shows a bright and charming, well-dressed little African child about 4 or 5 years old. The advertisement says, "He speaks fluent Ewe, why can't you?" I can tell you why you can't, because you didn't hear it when you were 4 years old. That's why you can't. The answer is very simple. But there is this message, nevertheless, that it would be possible for some of us, if we're going to have contact with Africa at all, to learn something of African languages, of the language or languages of the people to whom we're going to speak, if only it's a matter of knowing how to ask for a cup of coffee and how to exchange greetings. These are matters, I think, of human courtesy and of human decency. But what of things on the larger scale? We can talk about human relations, and we can all get very sentimental about these things, but what about matters of national policy, political campaigning, the press, and as I said, radio and television? How do you handle these things? Well, the one thing that I can hope for in Africa is that more and more recognition will be given to more languages than those already recognized as being important. In Nigeria, there is a developing emphasis on some of the languages and a developing literature in some of those languages. Perhaps the four languages of greatest prestige: Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, and although not the next largest in size by any means, Bini. I hope that such an emphasis can be continued and that literature also can be developed in some of the other largest languages of Nigeria, particularly Efik and Tiv and Fula and Ijaw. I hope it will be possible to include these languages in our Peace Corps instruction in due time. Just today, we started, for the first time anywhere in this country, instruction in Efik for a group in the Peace Corps. And we have some assurance that, if at all possible, those whom we are training in Efik will be sent to that part of eastern Nigeria where Efik is spoken and not relegated to somewhere else where a language they have been torn away from for the past 4 weeks is spoken instead. I hope that it will be possible to expand interest in Africa and in this country into a wider variety of languages in Africa, not all of them the biggest. Now, I realize it's perfectly true that in Tanganyika, if you're going to go to Tanganyika, the language to use, to learn, is Swahili. Unless you happen to be going to a particular town that you know about where some other language is much better spoken and understood by a majority of the people. But for the most part, Swahili is a convenient language for Tanganyika. To a lesser extent, Swahili is useful in Kenya, to a somewhat lesser extent still in Uganda, and though in part in a different dialect form in the eastern part of the Congo. Now, this does not mean by any means that Swahili is the native language of all of these people. However, Swahili does stand in a rather unique position as the major languages of Africa go. And the reason for that is this: Swahili was spread at an early date over a wide area, not necessarily among a large number of people, but it was spread over a wide area because of the accidents of the Arab slave trade and other commercial enterprises in East Africa. Furthermore, a very large number of the peoples, the tribes, who came into contact with Swahili already spoke languages that were related to Swahili, some of them very closely related to Swahili. The general structure of the languages was quite similar to that of Swahili, and the task of learning Swahili was relatively easy. Perhaps you know, perhaps you don't know, that there are parts of Germany where the home dialect is not even mutually intelligible with the standard German that is taught in schools. And yet it is closely related. It is very similar. And for the child to go to school coming from such a home dialect and then be exposed to standard German is not a terribly traumatic experience for him. Now, many of these local dialects are disappearing in Germany today. In some areas, I believe they still exist. Certainly a generation or two ago, they were very common. But it's not an impossibility. It's not a terrible drawback for children from such a background to go to school and learn standard German. Similarly, where you have languages closely related to Swahili in East Africa, it is by no means impossible and not by no means a serious drawback to go to school and there learn Swahili. The same situation, however, does not obtain in many other parts of Africa. In Nigeria, for example, Hausa belongs to a completely different language family from the other major languages of Nigeria. Hausa is very distantly related, among other things, to Arabic and the other Semitic languages, to the Berber languages of Northwest Africa, and to the Cushitic languages of the Ethiopian Horn area. Hausa has some closer relatives in northern Nigeria and the surrounding areas, but it is unrelated completely to Yoruba, Igbo, and so on. It is no more related to them than English is. Now, there are certain cultural characteristics that these peoples share, and so perhaps Hausa is easier for an Igbo to learn than English is, given the same amount and the same kind of exposure, but the difference isn't that great. And as a matter of fact, when people use Hausa as a second language, many of them speak it atrociously. Americans, Europeans, let's say, in northern Nigeria, are noted for their unintelligible Hausa. I might add that the Jukun people of northern Nigeria are as noted for their unintelligible Hausa. It may be unintelligible in different ways than ours is, but it is nevertheless very bad. Even in the southern parts of Nigeria, the west, midwest, and east, Yoruba and Igbo, although ultimately related to each other, are not particularly closely related to each other. They are not as closely related to each other as English and German are, for example. Perhaps a little bit more like English and French. And even that is deceptive because English has so many borrowings from French. So shall we say English and Romanian. So that for a speaker of Yoruba to learn Igbo or vice versa is not an extremely practicable thing, certainly not as practicable as for a speaker of Chaga in Tanganyika to learn Swahili. So here it is necessary again that more attention be paid to more languages, and at the same time that efforts be made to have effective instruction in whatever languages are going to be taught as second languages. This may be true in the future in a place like Nigeria for teaching Yoruba, let us say, to speakers of Nupe, a language just to the north of Yoruba. I don't know that any Nupes will want to learn Yoruba. They may prefer to learn Hausa. But all right, let us say teaching Hausa to speakers of Nupe or to speakers of Tiv. If such a program is going to be introduced on a wide scale, it ought to be introduced effectively and not just haphazardly. And the same thing, of course, must apply then to instruction in Africa in the European languages, which will, in almost every case, undoubtedly be the ultimate national or official languages of these African nations, particularly in terms of international relationships. English language teaching programs, French language teaching programs, and programs for whatever other European languages must be taught, must be made more effective and must be planned more carefully. I just heard the other day of a program sponsored by a great American university in the East, a program in Nigeria for teaching English. And the whole program of curriculum planning for English in pilot schools was turned over to some college graduates who had been trained in this country without any courses in the structure of English, without any knowledge of Yoruba, the language of their community, without any knowledge of descriptive linguistics which would enable them to find out something about Yoruba, without any concept of what we mean by the technical term contrastive analysis, the comparison of English and Yoruba in this case to see where the difficulties in learning are, and furthermore, with no concept at all of how to go about teaching a second language in the first place. Here we were with people, possibly products of an education department, this I don't know, but nor do I mean to deplore the possibility. But in any case, graduates of an American institution of higher learning who were completely unequipped for the job that they were called upon to do. In order to solve a problem like this, we will have to multiply in this country and in England and in France the planning programs, the training programs for teachers of English and French and whatever languages they may be as second languages. We have here at UCLA a substantial program in the teaching of English as a second language. And yet, when we wanted to give such training to our Peace Corps volunteers this fall, we were so hard up for assistance that I was able to cable a young man, a young American in West Africa, that he would be welcome in our graduate program in linguistics here if he would accept employment as a teaching assistant for our Peace Corps program in the teaching of English as a second language. This is how difficult, this is how understaffed, how undermanned we are for this task. And yet it is the big task, I think, that faces Africa today in communication, the techniques of teaching a second language. Now, when we teach an African language in this country, we don't for one moment assume that because you, I speak to an African now, because you speak Swahili or Yoruba or Efik or Zulu, are thereby qualified to teach your language. Because, you see, you don't know what the American learner's problems are. There are many complications in the structures of your languages that Americans find very difficult. And even if you have a teacher's certificate in your own country for teaching your language, that certificate implies at best a training for teaching native speakers of that language how to write it and to read it, how to express themselves more accurately in it, but it has nothing to do with how you teach it to a foreign learner. Now, conversely, we are equally aware that just because an American college student or college graduate happens to be a native speaker of English, this fact does not for one moment qualify him to teach English in Africa or anywhere else in the world to people who have never known it before. For in our own right, without special training, we have no concept of what your language learning problems are. We have no concept of the difficulties that an African has in learning English, and the difficulties are considerable. The difficulties are in part because of the structure of English, elements that we are not ourselves conscious of. I said to some students the other day, don't ask your African language assistant, what is the difference in meaning between such and such an expression and such an expression? If he says they're almost the same, don't ask him what's the difference. Could you quickly tell me what is the difference in meaning between these two sentences? I'll mail that letter. I'm going to mail that letter. They're both future, and yet there is a difference between them. I'll let you go home and mull it over. We are not in ourselves, without special training, equipped to analyze and to present the structure of our own language. Not only that, but we do not begin to realize what the difficulties of the speakers of, let's say, Yoruba are in learning English, as opposed to the difficulties of speakers of Igbo, and they are quite different difficulties in some respects, or the difficulties that obtain for the speaker of Hausa. I suspected that it was probable that certain English sounds were going to be difficult almost all over Africa. So one time in northern Nigeria, I gave a nice little demonstration to some Americans as to how to go about teaching English. I said to these Americans, now you know, of course, that the sounds which we spell with the writing TH in English are not usually found in other languages. They're very rare sounds in languages of the world. But there is a way to teach them. You ask a student to hold a pencil in front of his lips, and then to touch that pencil with his tongue, and then let the air come out around his tongue. So he's saying with the tongue against the pencil. And then you can try to get him to say things like thin, thin, thin. I demonstrated this with a group of Africans, and they performed magnificently. Now, it happened that about half of these Africans were speakers of a language that up until that time I hadn't heard of, Tigum. And a few days later, my wife started work on the Tigum language, and the first thing she did was to ask her assistant, what in Tigum is your word for yams? And he said, thiri. Well, in this case, we were not aware of the ease of this particular detail of English for that particular student. More often, we're not aware of the difficulty. So one of the major problems, you see, for communication in the multilingual context of Africa is a problem that rests on the shoulders of established educational institutions in Africa, such as the University of Ghana, the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, Makerere in East Africa, and others. It also rests as a responsibility, if we are responsible at all for the rest of the world, and I believe we are, on the universities of England and America and France and other countries. A responsibility to increase and to improve our techniques of teaching second languages and of teaching other people how to teach second languages. A cadre of Americans and Britishers may be a valuable thing in English, in those parts of Africa where English is the major European language, to establish and set up programs in the teaching of English. To this will have to be added qualified Africans, those who themselves handle English best, because they will ultimately be the teachers in their own schools. And lest we perpetuate errors, we have to get good students to be good teachers. These, then, I believe, are some of the major problems that face Africa today. They are problems which as they are solved, they are problems, the solution to which will be gradual, but will bring along with it an improvement in overall communication, an improvement in political unity, in a feeling of political unity, a healthy nationalism, will bring about also economic advantages, and all of the other things that Africa so desperately yearns for, and which, I believe I speak for all us Americans, we so willingly and eagerly hope for Africa. As these problems of communication are gradually overcome, or at least alleviated, by the best that we all can do, Africa will be increasingly in a favorable position to take its part in all of world affairs. And finally, there's one respect then in which I envy Africa and Africans. I envy them their present and their coming multilingualism. I think that we in America have been deprived because we have not, for the most part, had the advantages of a second language and with it, at least partially, a second culture. And I hope that our increasing knowledge of Africa and understanding of African problems may make it possible also in our schools, right on down to the elementary school as time goes on, for our children and their children to have advantages that we have never had, the advantages of knowing more of this wonderful world of ours and of knowing it better by being able to communicate better. Here is where Africa has an advantage, and where Africa, I hope, can teach something to us. It can teach us perhaps to overcome some of the fear of learning a second language. It can help us to overcome some of our prejudices against another culture. It will help us to understand better this world in which we live, and thus hopefully also to understand ourselves better. So multilingualism in Africa is indeed a problem of communication. But it is a problem that is not without its bright areas, and it is not a problem that leaves Africa by any means beyond hope. Africa will end up quite differently from England, but that doesn't mean worse, could it? Africa will end up differently from this country. Here we started with multilingualism, and we've brought it into a melting pot that has brought us out monolingual. Africa is not under the same influences of immigration. Africa will continue to be multilingual. but there are certain advantages and certain blessings in that, and there are ways around the problems that exist. No sudden solutions, no great white hopes that will make a difference in short order, but there are things that can be done to improve the situation where it is difficult. And I hope, for one, that those things will be done without destroying the wonderful things that Africa already has in its rich heritage of many cultures, many languages, many tribes, but that those many will finally work together as one, and in a way perhaps in which we cannot know, be a real unity. I thank you.
I know I speak for all of you in thanking Professor Welmers for that almost totally monolingual discussion of the multilingual problems. And now, as is our custom, Professor Welmers will entertain questions from the audience. Why don't you just step up here?
Would you rather Professor Welmers entertain the audience? Just to make sure that I'm not going to be monolingual. Cambote back there. So nice to see you. Yes.
Isn't it possible that the approach to the problem of multilingualism in Africa is really more of an indirect one than a direct attack on the diversity, or rather a direct attempt to develop less of a multitudinous nature of this language? What I'm trying to say is that directly the development, industrial development and economic development, and the physical creation of physical communication, transportation, radio, telephone, and so forth, that these things will indirectly lead faster toward an intercommunication than if we were to concentrate entirely on the language problem per se.
Yes, I'm sure that all of these things will work together simultaneously. I think that the problem of instruction in languages is nevertheless a crucial one because I'm afraid it has lagged behind already. We have a certain amount of industrialization and economic development and so on in areas where still the problem of communication is considerable. An old one was the instance of the Firestone plantation in Liberia, where at one time the Firestone Company decided it would be a good idea for some of its people to learn one of the local languages, and they called in a linguist to do something about it. Unfortunately, it was an ineffective job, but they saw the need, and they were bringing in, and they are still bringing in, tribespeople from the interior, and having a great deal of difficulty in communicating with them about the actual job that they have to do. But your side of it is absolutely right, that other developments, transportation, travel, economic developments, will also tend to hasten the day of more use of intertribal and even international languages. There's a wonderful Yoruba proverb, which I unfortunately cannot, in this case, quote in Yoruba. I can get a cup of coffee in Yoruba, though. A wonderful Yoruba proverb which says, in English translation, the man who learns English does not die in his hometown. Yes, question back there. And then,
in your opinion, what language in Africa today would be best suited
for the time being, English in the areas formerly administered by the British, plus Liberia, and French in the areas formerly administered by the French. As time goes on, however, there will be more English taught in the French areas, so-called French areas, more French taught in the so-called English areas, and my offhand guess at the moment is that if there's ever going to be any African European language, that is, any European language most commonly used for technical purposes all over Africa, it would be English. But that's a guess. I'd rather answer the question 40 years from now. Yes?
Well, I was going to
It is indeed. But English is now used to some extent by some people in Tanganyika, Kenya, Uganda, Central Africa, what has been the Federation, South Africa, and in West Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, and so on, while Swahili is usable only in a much smaller area, perhaps by more people, but in a much smaller area. Swahili is perfectly adaptable, and other languages can be made adaptable too. It's merely a matter of adding vocabulary, either by borrowing or by rephrasing in the language. I think there was a... All right, go ahead.
Do you think, sir, that ultimately there will be an international language, or that there will be some language today used as an international language?
On certain levels, yes, and on certain levels there already is one, and it's English, more than any other one. But this does not mean for everybody in the world. One fellow whom I consider utterly irresponsible for having said this said in print a few years ago that English could become the second language of the world in our generation. Well, it could if every American, every Britisher, every Australian and New Zealander and Liberian native speaker of English were trained in the techniques of teaching his second language, and then if all of us were evenly distributed over the entire population of the world, and all the people of the world forced to attend our language classes 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. But short of that, no, there are still going to be millions and millions of people that aren't going to learn English in our generation or in the next century. But at the level of administration, at the level of scientific conferences, yes, there'll be more and more of it. English, at present, even now, English, French, and Russian will handle a large number of people, and I think in our generation we'll see English increasing, even as we have in the past. Yes, back there?
I have say in non-professional circles, especially in the Western countries, the more language you pass on that, the less flexible it becomes in any of the ones that speak. And on this question, I might mention that the pronouncement of supervisor of schools was needed before the discussion was whether or not we could use a second language. And he said that English was good enough. So long as English was good enough.
Thank you. That's a new version of an old story, and I still like it.
How much longer than the allegation called, and the less, the more language the person learns, the less effective it becomes.
I don't know. Yes, to what extent is it true that the more languages a person learns, the less effective he becomes in any of them? I don't know. I can't cite myself as an example because I'm not so good in that many. But I'll give you a little example from Africa. Kwame Nkrumah is not at present a fluent speaker of any African language. Fanti is probably his best, but the last Ghanaians with whom I talked had their chuckles about the way he spoke Fanti. He speaks Tree and a little Ga, and Nzima, his childhood language, he hasn't spoken much since he was a child. His best language, actually, is English, but he's pretty effective in one way or another. I don't know. I'd hate to answer that question. Some of the people I have found most effective in communication on a variety of subjects have been at least bilingual. Some of our greatest scientists in this country are European-born. English is their second language. And there's a nice old story about, I won't try to quote the languages, the Russian Sputnik and the first American space vehicle that met in outer space, and after trying at each other in Russian and English, they finally agreed that they'd better revert to their mother tongue, German. I think that within limits, say, maybe 3 or 4 languages, I don't think it interferes much with a person's effectiveness. Yes?
Several years ago, Esperanto was sort of a popular concept and an approach towards the problem of international communication. What is your judgment of Esperanto, and to what extent is it used in Africa?
Have you ever heard it?
No.
I don't think any African has either. I've actually heard of a native speaker of Esperanto. His mother was Swedish and his father was French. And the only language they had to communicate, they met at an Esperanto convention. The only language in which they could communicate was Esperanto. And they settled in a rural community where their children had no contacts outside their family, and their children's first language was Esperanto. But the very fact that it has not spread any more than it has, I think, shows the weaknesses in that type of an artificial interlanguage language. Now, there are possibly different functions for that. The trouble with that as a true international language is the same as the trouble in English. You still have to learn it. And if it can be said that Esperanto is somewhat easier, I don't know that that makes that much difference. I do know that if Esperanto is going to be spread, or any other language, primarily in writing, what you'll end up with is 3,000 more languages, or at least a very large number of more languages, people who will pronounce Esperanto and use grammatical constructions in Esperanto in ways that they do in their own language, and therefore each one is actually devising another language. This isn't meant to disparage these efforts, but Esperanto and Interlingua and most of these attempts have assumed that the Romance languages, and to a lesser extent the Germanic languages, are languages that are known by everybody. But English is probably easier than Esperanto for a Chinese, to whom it's all Greek anyway. However, at the same time, a thing like Interlingua, or Esperanto, I prefer Interlingua myself, is not a bad thing for certain types of scientific publications. I read an article in Interlingua one time and finally got to the bottom of the page. It was just a brief one-page article, and it said, if you were able to understand this article, you may be interested in more information about Interlingua. Up until that time, it hadn't occurred to me that I wasn't reading some Romance language that I didn't know very well. I followed it perfectly. It was no trouble at all. For certain types of some scientific writing, not speaking now, but writing, this sort of thing may be helpful. But for spoken communication and for the overall problems of communication, I don't think that any such artificial languages are going to work. Yes, down there.
You said you could promote national unity by preserving the small language. Now, suppose you mentioned the example of Nigeria. Now, how could a man whose main language was Jukun be in politics in a land in the majority speak Hausa?
He would have to learn Hausa as a second language, to be sure.
But you said it sounded awful.
I said what?
That it would sound awful if it speaks.
Oh. Well, so far as I know, there are no speakers of Jukun in politics in the North. And if there are going to be, they'll have to learn to speak Hausa a great deal better than they do now, indeed.
You perpetuate the disparity between the types in that way. While if you try to make one language, eventually it will be
I don't think so, even eventually. There are, for example, quite a few people in Sierra Leone who speak something that derives from an effort that was made by people to adopt English and English only as a language because their native languages were so different. Sierra Leone Creole. Sierra Leone Creole is not intelligible to us. We simply cannot understand it at all. Now, I speak of the preservation or the recognition or the dignity of Jukun or other small languages from the viewpoint of national unity in this sense, that if the language is disparaged, a Jukun is going to feel very resentful. He's going to be a type of fighter in politics for little local favoritisms that really have no place in the society. Where if his own people and his own language are recognized as being perfectly all right, he's going to feel a lot better about it and a lot more loyal to his government. But now if he is going to be in the parliament in northern Nigeria, he's going to have to learn to speak pretty good Hausa. And there are not many speakers of Jukun at present who can do that. There are some, to be sure. But I think it may be significant that there are no Jukun that I know of in politics in northern Nigeria yet.
How is it in India? They have the same problem.
Yes, there are many of the same problems, and that is the reason why English has come to be I don't know if I dare call it official. I'm not an India specialist, but certainly it has come to be the major language of interlingual communication. Yes, ultimately. We'll see if it works out. Yes?
Do you see any development of the present languages spreading in other areas like Swahili? Is it spreading or how?
Oh, to some extent, but not very rapidly. Not fast enough to satisfy us impatient people in this generation. Gradually, imperceptibly, some of these will spread. Perhaps the fastest progress of that sort has been made by Sango in Central African Republic within the past 30 or 40 years. I wouldn't be surprised at the number of people who can understand Sango, at least, and speak it to some extent, has doubled in the past 30 or 40 years. This is a spectacular increase. But I think it's very unusual, and I'd really hardly expect it to happen. I wouldn't know where to predict that it will happen, and least of all do I know how to bring about such a thing. I think there was a question down here. Yes?
I was wondering if I was interpreting you correctly in the advantage that you give to Africa in its present situation, that at least they are not fooled by the situation, thinking that they have a communication that could, that a monolinguistic society could think it has, simply because it spoke the same language. Does not necessarily mean, however, would not necessarily mean that they would be communicating among each other. And if the hope of Africa lies in their accepting the problem of establishing communication, not bypassing it, and having a substitute for real communication is something that makes it easier, or apparently communicate. A single language rather than many languages in which each one is forced, compelled to understand his neighbor, or the other person, rather than simply get along with it.
In some respects, you may not completely have understood me. I thank you for flattering me because you are saying more than I said. There is more to communication than language. That is certainly true. I think that there are some Africans who are actually fooled by it. They may think there's more communication than there is. But certainly there's much more opportunity for recognizing the situation, and in that respect I think they're fortunate. Yes?
Sir, don't you agree that there's a small percentage of the population of any country that has the talent to speak, let's say, 4 languages, 4 or 5?
No, I don't really think so. It's not so much talent as it is opportunity. We learn our native language because it's spoken all around us, and I think we learn a second language when we hear a good deal of it, and if it hits us early enough in life. There is one respect, though, in which cultures differ from each other, and here I think the African has an enormous advantage. We Americans are, I think, in general, prone to stage fright. Most of us are not hams. Some of us are. But most of us find it a traumatic experience to try to speak a second language even when we know a little of it. I'll never forget the first time I forced myself to try to use a language other than English. I was shaking in my boots and sweating all over. It was a terrible thing for me. Well, there are some people for whom that is not true, but that's a very common reaction in America. Now, I'd say there are some people for whom that reaction obtains in Africa as well. But I think to a much larger extent, Africans, because of and this lies in the background of their cultures, in the background of their social psychology, shall we say, Africans are much more prone to be free and perfectly willing to try to express themselves whether they really can or not. They're much more willing to strike out at it. I've got a wonderful African student in an African language class this year. He's from the Congo. His native language is Chiluba, and he's learning Yoruba. And he may not get it right, but boy, he shouts it out every time he has a chance. And I think this is very common among Africans. And it's one thing that goes into making speakers of a second language. There's no doubt of it. If we were all Danny Kays, it'd be a different thing. Yes?
Again, I've understood that it's sort of an artificial language, with a great deal of borrowing and addition and so forth. And, it's widespread use. It wasn't.
Mm-hmm. artificial isn't really the word for it. It is a language that has been subjected to a great deal of outside influence. That is true. It is in structure typically a Bantu language. There are only a very few details of Bantu language structure that have been lost in Swahili. Because it was used by Arab traders, and they traveled with Swahili porters and Swahili interpreters into the interior, Swahili did acquire a lot of Arabic borrowings, but as any language does, it acquired borrowings largely on the technical level, on the level of things that were not commonly expressed in the culture to begin with. Compare, for example, the case of English and its borrowings from French. We borrowed the language of the banquet hall in words like beef and pork and mutton, but we retained the Anglo-Saxon words out in the barnyard, where we still call them cows and sheep and cows and pigs and sheep. Well, so in Swahili, the language of everyday life can be employed using very few borrowed words from Arabic because the concepts aren't necessary. But when you start talking about certain kinds of products and varieties of boats, which are used in trade, clocks and watches, and times of the day, and so on, then you start getting into things that were imported concepts, and so the terminology for them is also imported. Now, as the culture spreads in which these concepts are necessary, so it's quite easy to spread the language with them. It is in Swahili that one talks about certain things with Arabic loanwords, and it is only when one starts to talk about those things that one is exposed to Swahili anyway. And that, I think, explains exactly why it has spread so far and so rapidly. Well, not so very rapidly. It's been going on for several hundred years, as a matter of fact. I think there was another question just in the back. That's right.
Comment on the place of pidgin languages.
Yeah, don't ignore them. I mentioned Sierra Leone Creole, which is based on a partially learned English of a century or more ago, more than a century ago. It is now the native language of a number of people in Sierra Leone. It was, in turn, about in the 1840s, spread down the coast to Nigeria and the Cameroon area through efforts of the Sierra Leonese to get into trade and mission work. And it has become very widespread in the Cameroon area and in the eastern part of Nigeria particularly, a little bit elsewhere, in a form widely known as pidgin, now more accurately known as, by the people's own choice, as Westkos, meaning the language of the West Coast. It is called a pidgin, and a Creole language is a pidgin which has become the native language of some people who speak it. Actually, what very few people have known until exceedingly recently, within the last 2 years at the earliest, is that this Westkos, so-called pidgin, is actually only a different dialect of the same language that in Sierra Leone is known as Creole. And a speaker of Creole can understand somebody from the Cameroons with no difficulty at all, and vice versa. Now that's a very important one then. It's important particularly in areas like parts of eastern Nigeria and the Cameroon, where the population speaks a large number of small languages, and pidgin becomes the language of intercommunication, just as, say, in northern Nigeria, Hausa does. In a leper colony in the Cameroon, there were at one time some 400 patients, and I seem to recall a report that there were 40 different languages spoken by those 400 patients, no one of them spoken by as many as 50 people. And pidgin was the language that they used. There is, I believe, a Portuguese-based pidgin in Portuguese Guinea. Actually, a couple of the African languages have become pidginized. Kikongo has given rise to something known as trade Kikongo or Kikongo veiculaire, or Kituba is the local name for it. And this is really a sort of a pidginized Kikongo with some of the structural characteristics of Kikongo lost or simplified in great ways. These can be important languages. Because of human psychology, they'll probably never become languages of great prestige, because even Sierra Leone Creole or Westkos sounds enough like English to us that when we listen to it, we tend to snort, unfortunately. Yes?
Can you elaborate on the problem of book publishing and school texts?
Yeah. I don't want to put in a commercial, but buy a multilith machine. I say this very seriously. I have the same problem in my problem of textbooks for African languages. And there was a time when, and if I hadn't moved, I would still own it, a time when I literally owned a multilith machine. And I did everything about my textbooks, from writing the first draft to binding them with a stapler, to be sure. This can be done on small scales in a surprisingly effective way. I don't mean that it's an answer to all the world's problems or anything like that, but I'm afraid that people have put too much, laid too much emphasis on the prestige of a hardback book, when something else can serve the purpose in small quantities just as well. Mm-hmm.
Have you done any work at all with the poison or click language?
No, I haven't. Not one bit. Yeah, there's a South African scholar, Westphal, who's working on them. How effective his work is, I haven't even followed that very closely. I know of another scholar whose work I admire very deeply, Desmond Cole, who has done some work on them, but not really a great deal. They're very fascinating languages, but they're a little bit out of the way and hard to get at unless you go to the spot. You don't readily find speakers of them in this country. I had a letter from an anthropology student at the University of Chicago just before last spring. He wanted me to send him a list of possible TiEV informants in the Chicago area. And I was tempted to send him a blank piece of paper, but I felt I ought to tell him more than that. As far as I know, there's not a speaker of TiEV in this country, and that's a language of 700,000 people in Nigeria or more, certainly spoken by far more people than speak all of these Khoisan or Click, Bushman, Hottentot languages put together. Several times as many. Mm-hmm.
Would you say that there's an appreciable number of languages on the African continent that have a common family origin like the Europeans have?
Yes. Well, Europeans, if you mean geographically, you've got to exclude Hungarian, and Africa is a little bit like that. That's just it. There are 4 major language families represented in Africa. Hausa and its relatives in northern Nigeria I did mention as related to Berber and Semitic and the Cushitic languages of Ethiopia, and that accounts for 1 family. Then generally along the fringes of the Sahara and in the east, ducking down a little bit farther, is a second family, the Nilo-Saharan family. It has only 1 language with more than 1 million speakers, that's Kanuri, but it is scattered over a wide area and a large number of languages. The third family is this very small one just mentioned, the Khoisan, which includes the Bushman and Hottentot languages in South and Southwest Africa, and 2 very small languages in Tanganyika, Sandawe and Hadza. And then the 4th family, we believe, the Niger-Kordofanian family, accounts for all the rest, including languages as widespread as Dakar and the Cape in South Africa, and west coast to east. Yes?
Yeah. With respect to these major languages, how do you explain the micro-distribution of several languages within a small locality, as for instance in Baminda in northern Cameroon?
Ultimately, by a historical breakdown of communication. This is a hilly, indeed mountainous terrain, and until relatively recent times, there was not a great deal of travel around. People came in, settled down in a little valley or on top of a hill, and were able pretty much to live their own lives in isolation from other people. This is still true for some of these small tribes, and languages split and stay apart where there is a minimum of communication. Languages tend to remain unified and perhaps to grow, if prospects for population growth are good, only when there's a great deal of intercommunication. It's interesting that also in this country, the most divergent dialects, the greatest areas of dialect diversity, are precisely where people have done the least traveling around. In the hill countries of the east and southeast, in much of the south, and in rural New England. And that's precisely where there's the greatest dialect difference as well. That's been the story of 300 years or so. When you add to that thousands of years, as you probably have to for Africa, that explains this sort of thing too. Mm-hmm.
You said as you began that with immigration going down, I assume you meant from the European countries, that the use of that language would go down. And how would that correlate with the need for European languages, I would think for technological reasons and cultural reasons and scientific and all that.
If I understand you, I think what I meant was that if you have an immigration into an area in which a minority group comes in and accepts and absorbs the culture of the majority around them, they will also accept and absorb that language. To give a very simple example, the missionaries' kids in the interior of Liberia speak Loma. And I've known a missionary to come back here. His wife had to come back 3 months early. And his little boy was just at the time where he was acquiring speech habits very quickly. And when he and his little boy came back 3 or 4 months later, the mother and son could not communicate with each other. This was the immigrant learning the new language. But on the other hand, in terms of international communication, in terms of small numbers of people not accepting the culture, but interacting with it, remaining representatives of an alien culture, and establishing relations with this culture, in those contexts, then the need for a language for technical communication is quite obvious. Yes?
Is it easier for a student reading and writing his own native language first?
I don't know. I doubt if that makes any difference. I will say this, however, that I would, for other reasons, conclude that it is tremendously important for the child, if at all possible, to learn to read and write in his native language first before he tries to learn a second language. Now, my reason for saying that is this. First, in schools, when a child is taught a second language right from the beginning, he's usually expected to learn to read and write it also immediately. And then he's learning two things at once. If I may summarize another 1.5-hour lecture in 2 minutes, the African, very frequently, the African child goes through 3 traumatic experiences in the process of acquiring an education. One is the substitution of school discipline for home tribal discipline. The second is the substitution of a new language for his own. And the third is learning that a language is more than noises you make, it's also squiggles that you see and produce with your hands. Now, I think that the child should not have all those 3 traumatic experiences at once. Ideally, let him have a kindergarten first in which he learns about the new discipline. Then let him learn to read and write, in which he gets into this idea that education means more than just a new community. And then finally let him learn a new language. But that is my reason, not because it makes it easier for him to learn the language, except psychologically, not linguistically. Yes?
To go along with that question, how many of the 1,000 languages are actually written?
About a third of them. They're, in general, the largest ones, so I should say that at least 80% of the people of Africa could have access to something written in their own language. But there are a couple of problems there. One thing that when I say these are written, it may be that there is no more than 10 pages of printed material in the language. Another, that while the language spoken by 1 million people may be written, it may be that only 100 people out of that million are actually literate and can read it. So illiteracy in the indigenous languages is a very major problem in Africa. But the facilities are there. There is, however, still a further problem that in many cases these writing systems are not adequate for the languages. They're not properly devised. But still in all, the situation isn't too bad as far as opportunity is concerned. Yes? Almost exclusively. Some of the languages of Ethiopia, well, Amharic is the official language of Ethiopia, though it's not the majority language, and it is now forbidden to use other languages for certain purposes. But where they have been written, some of the other languages of Ethiopia have been written in the Old Ethiopic, now Amharic syllabary. But the use of an Arabic-based writing system is almost non-existent today, although it has been tried a bit in the past. All right, one more. Yes?
How can teachers of English make non-native speakers of English feel they're losing their identity by pronouncing English well? I've experienced some of people are reluctant to pronounce English well because they're afraid of the pressure of friends. They are
That's an awfully nice question. I had a similar one not long ago, and I'll try to combine the answers to the two of them. In this case, it was a Peace Corps volunteer who was going to be teaching English, who said, how much should we strive to make our students sound like native speakers of English? I said, I don't care whether they don't. And this comes very close to home for you, if I may say so. I cited the comparison of Malayo-Polynesian and Southeast Asian languages. I love to hear speakers, female speakers of those languages, speak English. Not so much male speakers. It's quite a different effect to me. But I enjoyed that tremendously, even though it obviously was not native English, you see. Now, where's the compromise? I say I don't care whether it sounds like native English or not. What I want it to be is what this was an excellent example of. Not pronounced so that you can be understood, but pronounced so that you cannot be misunderstood. Although this was not native English, there was no question about understanding it. And that's what I want from the African. Thank you.